Hello and welcome to another live stream. I I should honestly have sent out a post about this live stream, so I have no idea how many of you are going to just randomly show up. But um, I I've had something of a weekend, so it's been a little bit of a crazy time. I went through the most insane push on Friday to get out every piece of digital content. So Worldbuilding Blueprints is out. Yeah, the PDF is out. The EPUB is out. The audiobook is out. They're all available on my site for purchase right now. Um, that's amazing. And then I also got the um, Thief's Magic out, which is a newsletter subscriber novella. So, um, that's if you're a newsletter subscriber, you should have a code in your email box that will let you download that novella for free. And I also made the audiobook for that novella part of the newsletter subscriber benefit. So you have a code for the audiobook as well. And the reason for that isn't all that swanky. It's not because I, think that my narrative voice is so amazing or anything like that. It's simply because um, I find that if I read the book like a narrator, right? So when I'm actually recording the book's final form as a narrator would, with like dialogue, and I can't do voices or accents or any of those fancy things, but in a kind of dramatic narrative way, I find that I catch, one, a lot of small grammar issues and spelling and so on, but two, I also sometimes get a little bit of like, wait, there's a better phrasing here. And then I can, fix that and modify it a little bit. And the book is actually better because of that final narrative read through, right? So even if I, someday get to the point where like it makes sense for me to pay a narrator to do like an official narrative copy and, audiobook, and have like somebody who can do accents and voices and all of those really cool stuff that, I'm like, that's not my bag. Even if I do reach that point and I do pay for those kinds of audiobooks, I'll still record my own version before sending them the final copy of the book, because I find so many little benefits to doing that final read through. So that's a very long story to say that the reason why newsletter subscribers get a audiobook for Thief's Magic, the novella, is because I edit better, or the books, in my opinion, are better if I do a narrating read through. And the only way I can motivate myself to do a narrating read through is to record it. So there you go. That's why you get a free audiobook. And very Merry Christmas to all of you. Really great to see you, Laura. Um, and yeah, okay. So that is the everything that's out. Go claim your books. If you're one of the Kickstarter backers, you should have a code to claim the PDF. If you didn't back the Kickstarter but want World Building Blueprints, it is now available in PDF form. The physical book will be available next year somewhere, after the Kickstarter fulfills. So the Kickstarter physical books will only go out next year. I needed two copy prints, two copy books to be printed, because the first one there's things I didn't like, so I changed some of the setup. So when I get my second copy now, we should be ready to go. But obviously, here we are. It's too close to Christmas to say that everything will be printed before that. All right, so let's talk about what I want to talk about today. And I do indeed want to talk about logic, and about the and economies and how to build them. So, since I have this handy dandy book, I am going to Let me just move this screen over there so I can still see chat. All right. So this is Worldbuilding Blueprints, the final complete copy that you can actually purchase, download, and have for yourself. And where I want to go is I want to go to the economy and talk about, I think it's in markets. No, it's over here. It's in economic activities. So this is about logistics change. I think I'm going to have to zoom in on this. Let me make it a single page. So, yes, you can. And there is a lot of help in there to make extra world building awesomeness. Okay, so in this part of the book, I was doing an exercise of mapping out supply chain resources, right? So, and the reason why I was doing this is because I feel like people sometimes get trapped in very weird ideas around how an economy works, like how markets work and how, money works. And they get very much like into the guilds and into the big trading organizations and so on. But at the root of an economy lies the flow of goods. Where do goods come from? What is the raw input into goods? How are they turned into actual product? And where does that product go? Right. So I took a fairly simplistic example here of this culture that they all wear these cloaks. Okay. The cloak is emblematic of their culture, and they make the cloak from goats, from goat fur. Okay. And basically, in order to produce a cloak, there's two kinds of cloaks. There's fancy cloaks and there's, normal common people cloaks. So, but in order to produce a cloak, a fancy cloak, there's got to be a farmer who has fancy goats on his farm. Okay. He has to shear fancy goats. What does that mean for his economy? It means that, or for the economy, it means that the farmer needs land, he needs goats, he needs things to feed the goats. It means that those goats need to be capable of living on that farm. Then, at least once a year, he needs to employ people to actually shear the goats, to like get the fur off them, right? Or it needs to be done with magic or whatever the case may be, but somehow the fur has to leave the goats. And this creates your first input into the cloaks. Then, and it's bought by the spinners. And spinning is such an underrated thing in pre-automation fantasy. People, let me explain something to you. Automating spinning is why we have clothes that we can replace every month or every 2 months or whatever the case may be, right? If to make a single pair of blue jeans with a manual person spinning would take the labor of a year to spin enough threads. Spinning is incredibly, unbelievably labor intensive. Okay. Women used to carry their spindles, either drop spindles or actual wheels, with them and spin everywhere. Women used to sit and spin by the fire. They used to tell stories and spin. Spinning happened everywhere all the time because creating thread is incredibly labor intensive. Okay, so lots of spinning happens to create threads, and that creates another input into these cloaks. All right. Now, these are fancy cloaks, so they get dyed special colors. That means that there needs to be dyers who go and find things that make dye. What makes dye? You get dye from plant material, you get dye from certain kinds of minerals, you can get dye from all kinds of experimentation. What does that mean for your economy and for your culture? It means that there must be somebody who gathers the raw dye ingredients. And it means there must be somebody who's experimenting with colors, who's going like, how do I make a red that lasts longer? How do I make a blue that actually looks blue, right? Think about like these people aren't automated. Okay? Maybe they are, in which case your supply chains look different, but they probably aren't in an automated era. Okay. So they have to have a place where they sit and experiment with, potentially hazardous um, chemicals. But also think about this in terms of rooms. You know, houses, all houses, used to have still rooms. And that doesn't mean like a be quiet room. It means a room where people kept like herbs, medicines, and all kinds of other like little alchemical things, because automation wasn't a thing that people had. You can't just pop to the shop and buy stuff. So you need a place where you can get these kinds of alchemical needs met, things like herbs and dyes and so on. Okay. So we've got threads and we've got dyes. Then you need the weavers, because now the weavers, they dye the threads and then they and then they weave the threads into cloth. And your final output is the clothier guilds, who then, actually sew the cloak into being from the woven cloth. And there's so much going on, and all of this is an internal supply chain, right? So this is just, okay, I want a culture that wears a cloak. What does that mean for their economy? If a piece of clothing is emblematic of the culture, what does that mean for these people? Right? And that is why supply chains are such an interesting way of looking at the economy when you're building out the economy, especially once you have your culture in place and you're like, okay, I need to build houses. What does that mean for my people? What do they use for a roof? Okay, start there. Look at your house. Look at your house as you live in it now. What do these people use for a roof? Slate, thatch, clay tiles. Think about what they have access to. Then think about, like, let's say it's thatch. Let's say they have thatch. What does that mean for their economy? It means there must be a thatcher who puts the thatch on the roof, but it also means that somebody needs to grow and harvest thatching straw. Thatching straw needs to be stored somewhere. So there needs to be some kind of like warehouse for the straw to go into, right? There needs to be, potentially somebody who grows it, unless they just harvest it wild out of a meadow. It's not, these are not things that you need deep economic understanding of supply and demand for. You just need to think about like how people need to achieve the things that they need in their life, right? So you've got your thatch roof. Okay, cool. Now, what are the walls of the house made of? Is it made out of wood? In which case, do they have forests with foresters? When they cut down a log, how does that log move from the forest to the village? Who cuts the log, the felled tree, into planks? Because, is that a specialist job? Is that something everybody does? Like, who owns the forest? Is it communally owned, or is it owned by, a specific lord who gives people logging rights? Like, what is the setup of getting the things that you need for your house? And then the same for your clothes, right? And those are just all your mundane supply chains. Okay, Blackstage, you are very, very, very welcome. And yes, a spinning wheel would make both an amazing an amazing weapon, but it's also a really good magic um, uh, system to to work with spinning and so on, because the language fits our language so well. There's a reason why we have so many like little idioms and sayings that refer back to spinning, because until it was automated, it was such a humongous part of every household's life, because it's incredibly labor intensive. Like, it's probably one of the most labor intensive things we do. Not because it's difficult, but because, boy, does it take a long time. It's just really slow work. Um, yeah. So that comes. Hello, Katie. This idea of like how the economy is doing is how many people need to work to feed the rest of the economy. Is always an interesting metric to look at in order to kind of see your economy. And speaking of that, you want to think also in terms of the supply chains of food, right? We, in our modern day and age, like I could go to the shop now and get, even here in Finland in the depths of winter, and get, some out of season fruit that's been flown in from Spain or Greece, or, it's one of the southern climes. It'd be expensive because, it's expensive to fly anything up to the pimple that sits on the arse end of Europe. But I love my country, don't get me wrong, but we are very, very, very far away from everything. Um, anyway, so but I can do that for two reasons. One, we have incredibly fast transportation. We have uh, planes and ships and so on. So that's one thing. We can cover the globe at a very high pace. But the second reason why I can get these out of season fruits is because we have refrigeration. We have preservation. Okay. Pre-refrigeration, kind of storage societies don't have that. All right. So when they grow food, they either have to use it at a close by market and almost immediately, or they have to preserve it in some other way. And that preservation in whatever other way you do it is how you get things like Swedish surströmming. I don't know if you've ever heard of this. This is the most disgusting thing you have ever in your entire life smelt or seen or heard of. It is horrifying. It's fermented herring. That's what it is. Surströmming, fermented herring. And it smells exactly like you'd think it smells. It is horrifying. The Swedes keep telling me that, no, see, it doesn't taste as bad as it smells, and it's an acquired taste. I'm like, it's a taste that I'm never going to acquire. I promise you that. It's terrible. But anyway, so but the reason why dishes like surströmming and so on exist is because they make the food last longer. And you will see that mostly in societies that have got very dramatic seasonal differences, right? So, like up here in the far north, we have to, our ancestors had to plan for the winter, right? Because you have the season starting in November and running through until March, when good luck getting any fresh food, right? They just it's you've got I don't know, 3 feet of snow, and it's minus 20 degrees Celsius, and it's just a horrifying time of year. So to survive that, you have to preserve enough food to make it through the winter. Okay, so how do you preserve food then becomes part of your food supply chain. right? So now you don't just need food in the summer. You now need a vinegar of some kind, or some kind of wine or honey. Honey, by the way, will last forever and you can keep it anywhere. It is an absolute legit superfood, because it is a super saturated liquid, which is to say there is so much sugar in it that bacteria can't live in it. That's why it's also used to treat wounds even today, because it actually like cleanses the wound of bacteria and stuff. So yeah, side note. But so you've got to pack away honey, or you have to, which means you need bees, you need beekeepers, you need people who like actually make sure that there's flowers and so on for the bees to live from. Um, you need a means to pickle meat, right, or freeze it if you slaughter the animals late enough. You need a means to protect the animals through the winter. So you need to potentially build buildings that can contain the animals through the winter. And that once again takes us to, where do you get the building materials from? Do you have, thatch roofing, timber, etc., etc.? So it's understanding your economy of your culture is not so much about the understanding the complex models of economies, although they can add a lot of flavor and fun to understand, like inflation and supply and demand and all of those kinds of things can add to your economy. But at the basic heart of your economy, it is about breaking down what people have access to, what they need, and how they get it. And the amazing thing about supply chains is, once you understand supply chains, you're then in a position to use them to create enormous tension, because supply chains are points of weaknesses, right? As we all discovered during COVID, when that ship got stuck in the Suez Canal, I think it was 2021, and the whole canal was closed, and the Houthis closing down like all of those things have massively impacted supply chains. And what's happened? All of our goods has become more expensive, because supply chains are the most easily disrupted part of an economy. And the reason for that is because it's the most difficult thing to protect. Like, think about it. Let's go back to our example of the Orkul again. All right. So attacking the farm will give you what? It'll give you the farmer and the goats. Okay, you'll prevent the cloaks being made, but the farmer probably has a fair amount of defenses around his farm. Okay, and it's a single point that can be defended. But when the wool is on the move to the spinners, it's at risk. All right. When the dyers are out there gathering dye, they're at risk. When the threads are being moved from the dyers to the weavers, it's at risk. When, like, the weaving probably happens in a secure location, but then the cloth has to move from the weavers to the sewers, to the clothiers guild. And all of these, like, points in between, all of these little, like, points in between the farmer and the final product, every single one is a point of failure. And that effect triples when you're talking about a international supply chain, a supply chain between cultures. Okay? I just want to quickly shout out Lord Beasts. Absolutely, yes. So if you have non-human people or people who've evolved certain poison resistances, they might be able to survive in an environment nobody else can, because of that poison resistance, which makes for a very interesting way to weave into the culture of the people why they can live in this environment. So I did another supply chain in the book. Let me just move this over here again. Um, Now, of course, I do not. So, by the way, if you're using this book, it does look better when you do it like this, as two pages next to each other, because there's like these pieces of spread art, like this one, which has got um, the trade route, the Silk Road, the Silk Road trade route. Goodness, I reference it often enough. Samarkand is one of the most interesting little cities in on this route. It actually is still one of the places that produces the most beautiful illustrated books in the world, and it was known in the medieval times as a producer of illustrated novels. I have a feeling I did. Huh. Man, I might not be able to find it. Um, so I did a magic item um, thing here somewhere, supply chain here, where I said, okay, so let's say that you're creating magic items, you're creating magic rings, but you need gold. Where does the gold come from? So in this case, the gold might come from a neighboring culture. Okay, that means the gold has to be transported from the mine and has to be brought into your culture. And that creates immediate tension, right? Because gold on the move is a very, very valuable thing to hit. I mean, that is instant money and it's easily spendable. So, um, if you start having international supply chains like that, you really start building potential tension where people can be like, okay, but you owe me this gold. Yeah, okay, but I sent it. I was robbed. Yeah, but that's not my problem. You owe it to me. So it becomes this like, who is going to pay? Who's going to carry the cost of the missing gold? And I mean, wars have been fought over that kind of thing. So, so there's a lot of tension in those international supply chains. Um, Okay. So let me actually go back to that. Man, this book came out well. I know. I'm talking about my own book, and that sounds like absolutely freaking um, arrogant and terrible and all of those things. But it did. It did come out really well. I'm very proud of the layout. I'm especially proud of the layout because I did the layout myself. So, I didn't pay anybody to do it or whatever. I did it myself in Affinity software, if anybody's looking for software to do it with. So yeah. Anyway, so the thing about trade. Thanks, Katie. I really am pleased with it. It really is. It really did come out great. Um, the thing about trade that people, I think, often don't think about is the complexity of moving goods across vast distances when you don't have when all that you have is animals, right? You don't have any kind of like motor vehicles or anything like that, and you have no way to preserve the foodstuffs. Okay, I mean, spice, there's a reason why spice flowed, because spice can be preserved, it can be dried, it can be taken from one place to another, and it's still good, right? And that's why you had a massive trade in spices during the medieval times. But it is expensive because you have to travel so far. I mean, think about the supply chain that we're talking about in terms of the supply chain of going to India, right? So going back to that supply, this Silk Route, look at where Delhi is. Spices ended up all the way over here in Europe. That is a long way with a lot that can go wrong, right? And even more so for obviously the silk that came all the way from China and across to Europe. And the thing is, I think one of the things that people often get wrong when they're setting up these trade networks is they go like, okay, so there's one merchant who goes all the way from Shanghai to Rome. And that's actually super unlikely. It's much more likely that there's a merchant who goes from Shanghai to Samarkand. And then from Samarkand, somebody else picks up the package and takes it to another place. And somebody else picks up the package and takes it to another place. And eventually it reaches, the market in Rome. So it's such a supply chains, these kinds of trade routes is such a fundamental reason of why cultures develop where they do, where they begin, and how trade happens because of how difficult it is to move goods until you reach like high levels of technology or magic. Obviously, I mean, if you have magic that has teleportation, you throw out all of our models and you adapt to a completely new world, because your cultures would then be exchanging information and goods and all the rest of it really fast. Exactly. So there is a reason why almost all early civilizations developed. In fact, I don't think there's a single civilization that did not develop connected to a river, especially a navigable river. If you can use the river to move goods, you have won the lottery. Your civilization has a massive, massive leg up. Right, and we see that with the Nile. We see that with the Yellow River Basin. We see that with the land between rivers, Mesopotamia. Is that Mesopotamia? God, the Tigris and the Euphrates. I think it's Mesopotamia. Speak under correction. You see that with the Indus Valley. All of it happens in river basins. And it's not just because you need water for the fields, there is that as well. It is also because water is a free transportation route. You build a barge, you put stuff on it, and you can float your stuff down the river. It is a massive, massive advantage in terms of where your civilization is located. And yeah, it's you can see it borne out on every continent. South America, North America, Africa, Europe, China. Navigable rivers are a freaking winner. It's sad how many times trading with one another can lead to war. So this is such a tricky thing. The thing is, trading should, in theory, lead to kind of joint prosperity and ties, and people, should not want to go to war and so on. But unfortunately, human beings have got a very funny way of thinking sometimes. Sometimes it's like, okay, I could trade for that marble, but if I hit you in the face and I take that marble from you, then I have two marbles and I didn't have to give you anything. And that's sometimes the extent to which people think about these things. And then, of course, hitting you in the face turns out to not be the greatest solution in the world. Yeah. When you get right down to it, we are the product of an evolutionary process that does reward apex predators. And we are an apex predator in our own niche. in our social niche. And war is an expression of aggressive socialness. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if we'll ever fully get away from it. It is, as you say, a sad state of affairs. But yes, the Pony Express is a great example of using animals to cover vast distances, right? But obviously, you can't carry a lot of weight like that. So you can use something like the Pony Express to create a postal system, but you can't use it to carry more than small valuable goods. So you still have to think about things like grain, especially, is a big one, right? Because grain you need is you there's a lot, you need to move a lot of it, and it's a massive bulk thing. So figuring out how to move grain within society, first of all, because obviously grain has to be milled. So you've got it on the farm. It needs to go from the farm to a place. From that place, it needs to be ground into flour, and then the flour can be baked into bread and whatever, right? And at the beginning, way back when we first started domesticating grain and becoming a sedentary population, people ground the flour by hand, right? And then everything can just happen on the little farm. You farm your grain off your field, you ground it into flour, and you bake your bread right there. But that is going to get you a subsistence economy. There's no surplus in that economy. Now, the reason why economists talk about surplus is because surplus is the amount of the economy that can make your society as a whole rich. It normally translates into somebody individually getting rich, but but it's like you can get rich. But basically surplus is what your society produces in excess of um, what they need to feed themselves. And you don't get that with subsistence economies. You have to have enough food being produced that you have like flour mills and separate storage and so on. And like way back when, the people we made rich were the temples, and then the emperors, and then this and now we make rich the freaking tech bros. Like, anyway. Hey, shout out. A pleasure to see you, David. Yeah, I love Cape Town. It's a beautiful city. I studied at a university town called Stellenbosch, which is close to Cape Town, where I studied mathematics and drinking wine. So, one thing I've never seen in stories is where necromancy is one of the So I don't think I've ever seen a necromantic system that produces a meat that is edible. And I think that would create a very funny economy. Also, a pretty horrifying one. And you're talking about like you slaughter a cow, which is, I mean, it must be fairly traumatic for the cow. They die. And then it's instead of just being dead, they get pulled back to be slaughtered. Do they get slaughtered once a day? Twice a day? Like, what does that do to your psychology? Can you imagine? That poor cow was like having panic attacks with like oh God, that's funny. Now I'm having images of like people getting resurrected like this, like and going through like counseling of like, I've had 3 deaths today and now I need to deal with like the panic of it. Oh, that's a horrifying and very funny thought, and it would make for a very humorous world to build. Like the ever present meat, the infinity cow. that can, you only need one cow, and you can just slaughter it as many times as you need to in order to eat. That's amazing. That's an awesome thought. um, yeah. So that was basically. Let's see. Do I have anything else on my notes here about? Oh, right. So I spoke earlier about like the whole thing around like supply chains being a point of weakness, right? If you are creating a if you're creating a empire and you want to have a rebellion against that empire, you want to hit that empire where it hurts, hit it in the pocketbook, hit it on the supply chains. Okay, have your rebels attack and break the supply chains, especially the food supply chains. Okay, now I'll say a couple of things. One, you're going to have to make peace with the fact that this is a morally gray thing to do. Because if you hit an empire's supply chains, you are starving somebody. Right? That is what you're doing here. You are destroying the food that's intended for this outlying province in order to create unrest in this outlying province. You are creating famine. Okay, this is the thing that you're doing. Now, your heroes, your protagonists, if they're the rebels, if they're your plucky group of rebels, might be okay with that. This might be a sacrifice they are willing to make. If you put together that as a plot line, you need to know that that is what you're doing and write them to be that morally gray. The best will in that category will always be the traitor Baru Cormorant. Man. Like, if you have not read that book, read that book. The economics gets a little heavy and hairy because it's about using inflation to bring down an empire. But that was a morally gray hero. Like, I am in awe of Seth Dickinson's ability to create this morally gray hero. Yes, the nation of Geb uses zombies and skeletons to farm. Also Eberron in I forget what the undead nation is called, but in Eberron there's an undead nation that uses skeletons on the farmlands. And man, I don't know if this was in a campaign that I ran, a campaign I played in, or if it was in the Eberron source book, but somewhere I read that there was somebody who's making a petition to the undead king to ban the use of zombies on farmlands for sanitary reasons, and to restrict it only to skeletons because, zombies might contaminate the food. And I was lying on the floor laughing so hard. It was so funny. Yeah, undead labor does make a lot of sense. At 100%. And yeah, so just on that empire note, it makes a lot of sense to disrupt an empire's supply chains. It is a very good way to create unrest, to create famine conditions, to create desperate people that resist the empire. And resistance to the empire means the empire has to expend resources on putting down that resistance. And remember, a rebellion against the empire, ultimately, they have to force the empire to expend resources in order to bring the empire down. Because an empire holds all of the levers of power, right? That's the thing about rebelling against the state. They have the army, they have the wealth, they have everything. Okay, you are a ragtag bunch of plucky, rebels with maybe a little bit of an alliance. If you are going to force the empire to its knees, you need to make them expend resources on not you. Because if they focus the entirety of the empire on you, you're done. Like, you get stomped into a mud puddle. So one of the ways of doing that is hitting the supply chains and causing supply disruptions throughout the empire, which makes everybody unhappy. 100% stopping water resources by damming up the river. Same thing. Water is a critical resource, and damming up the rivers not only makes people who depend on that water source need the water, but it also disrupts the transportation, right? Because a dammed up river can't be used to flow goods. And if your civilization is at the kind of like point where it uses water for anything like, say, milling, right? So you've got massive flour mills that grind wheat, and suddenly you remove the water flow, you're absolutely devastating to the economic supply chain right there. So yeah, nobody likes it when they can't get their daily match latte. They also don't like it when they can't get food or anything else. But yeah, I mean, this is the reality of rebelling against an empire, right? Is you rebels' hands aren't clean, and it's like it's one of the like, and I'm not saying that you must submit to an empire because not submitting to an empire makes you, morally gray. I'm saying that you need to understand that you're going to do morally repugnant things because there is no other way to win. um, um, you know, sometimes Lord of Beast, it depends. All right. Remember that people can control the flow of information as well. And the rebels might very well cause a famine over here and bring in food over there. Like that. I am not saying try this at home. Please don't misunderstand me. Please. I live in a country. I have no intention of rebelling against anything. I'm just saying that if I was doing this, what I would do is I would cause a famine and solve the problem. Right? So it cause the famine and then bring in food to and bring in food to bring the to then solve the problem as well, and basically get the PR gain from it, and make sure that the cause of the famine is not known to the people. And then it basically becomes a PR war, right, between the empire and the rebels. And it depends on how well the rebels can succeed at making the empire into the problem. Like if you can sell a narrative of like the empire has made you dependent on them, look at what happens if they can't get food, you think they're going to look after you, then you can get the people on your side with this rebellion. Again, this is all theoretical. I am not advocating for anybody to rebel against anyone. The first law really does handle revolution very well. Like Abercrombie does a fantastic job with a lot of his stuff. I'm sorry, Sid. I was actually saying at the beginning of the stream that I really meant to put up a post, but I have had a weekend. I have had a weekend. So, the rebellion empire issues can indeed lead to a lot of like negotiations around how to keep the thing moving, and sometimes that kind of supply chain issues can result in an outcome that the rebels can live with. Like say maybe a province breaks away and the rebels can live there outside of the empire control, or whatever the case is. Like it's rarely as clean as overthrow the corrupt imperial government and the whole empire collapses. I mean, Western Rome limped along for a long time after provinces started leaving and so on and so forth. The Eastern Roman Empire limped along even longer. It took the Fourth Crusade, followed eventually, like I think 200 years later, the Ottoman Turks conquering it. It fell that Constantinople fell, and brought a close to the Eastern Roman Empire. So yeah, I mean, a rebellion might succeed over here. That doesn't mean the whole empire falls over there. So, uh, um, yeah, you can use spies. You can collapse the empire from the inside. Again, the traitor Baru Cormorant. Man, Seth Dickinson, that book or that series. It like she is a dark, dark hero. Um, but very good. I love those books. But then, I mean, I also read, like, I read the God Speaker trilogy and all that, and like I was fine. So, um, yeah, um, yeah. I mean, corruption and rebellion. Even if your rebellion succeeds, the corruption probably lingers for a good long while, because even if you overthrow, let's say, the emperor, what happens is your y- the rebels can't completely replace the state. So some part of the state, of the imperial state, remains, and that part still has the inherent corruption, right? That created the situations for rebellion. That corruption doesn't just go away. It doesn't get fixed that easily, right? It takes time and effort and probably like years of somebody really hammering corruption all the time to fix that kind of thing. It's difficult. It is rooting out corruption is incredibly difficult, because it is very, very entrenched. So, yeah, you don't solve corruption by giving a pretty speech and saying, "I'm a solve corruption." Solving corruption is the work of years, and once you have solved it, you need to watch like a hawk, because you let one grain of corruption in, and like 10 minutes later, the whole freaking state is ballooned into one corrupt oligarchy. Like, sorry. Different rant. But yeah, corruption is a terrible thing. Yes, absolutely. Hitting supply lines can be exceptionally lucrative, and rebels generally need resources. And resources can be found in supply chains. So two birds, one stone, as it were. So, um, yeah, so that was my most of what I wanted to say, I think, about supply chains, and and working them into your economy, and how you should think about them, in terms of like, what do people need? How do they get it? Because that creates the real framework for your economy. Don't worry too much about, all of the other complicated stuff. Just think about what people need in their life, and how the supply chain gets it. So I'm just gonna I know. I know I'm talking about this book a lot. But you know what? It took 18 months to write. And a lot of layout. There's a chapter in here right at the end, chapter 8, where I specifically talk about a day in the life of your characters, right? And what you want to do here is, when you do this exercise, you want to do this exercise from different social strata's perspective. So what is a noble's day in the life of? What is a commoner's day in the life of? What is a merchant day in the life of, etc., right? And then, every time you go through these, don't just think about, like, what is this person's life like in terms of their, their home and hearth, for example. Where does the stuff they're using come from? How do they light their home? If it's candles, do they make candles themselves? Do they buy them? If it's oil lamps, where does the oil come from? Right? Where does the clay to make the lamp come from? Like, what does the lamp look like? Is it metal? Is it glass? Like, glass, clear glass is very difficult to make. In the Middle Ages, it was considered a treasure to have clear glass, to have white see-through glass. Like, more than gold, it was wealth to have such a glass. So think about things like that. Like, what is the wealth situation like, and where does it come from? Where do these things that they use in their home come from? In their hygiene, let's say they bathe. How do they bathe? Do they heat up the water? How do they heat up the water? Where do they get the wood from to make fire, or coal to make fire? Or, do they, what is the, how does the waste disposal work? All of these things contribute to their overall economy in terms of these things all need inputs. They all need goods that move around the economy. And that will help you build out a really organic economy. And it gives you some fantastic points of tension to poke at, whether you're running a game or whether you are writing a book, because supply chains are where your biggest risks lie for an economy. Much bigger than anything else, except maybe some kinds of inflation. But inflation is kind of rare. You need to in kind of medieval time periods and so on, you'd need to do inflation the way the Spanish did it. They stole they stole so much silver from South America that they gave their empire inflation. And it killed their empire. Yeah. I don't know. You got to laugh at these things, because if you don't laugh, you'll just spend a lot of time in tears about the stuff we do to each other. We humans. Yeah, unfortunately, that is also true. A corrupt administration might run things more efficiently. The hero might just actually not know what they're doing, and thus create a worse situation than the corruption. Yeah, and also it's important to bear in mind that in a trade route, like, every town you pass through is potential for taxation and price increases and all the rest of that. And that's, as I said, that's why spices were so expensive in Europe, because they came from India. That's why Roman glass was so expensive in China, because the Silk Route didn't just go one way. It wasn't just goods coming from China and India to Europe. It also went the other way. And what they carried primarily to China and India was glass, because the Italian glassmakers were particularly skilled at their craft. I mean, there's that whole island, Murano. I referenced it in my glassmaking video. It's somewhere in my back catalog. But there was this whole, like, glass island on Venice where they kept the glass people locked up. You went to that island and you didn't leave again. You were treated really well, but the secret of making glass was kept there. So yeah. How much of the economy is just the maths of logistics? A lot. An unbelievable lot of the economy. So to really understand an economy, the concept you have to understand is surplus, as in the surplus of goods produced by a given society. And that is just the goods that they produce that they don't need to use themselves. So you need to understand what their surplus is, and who has disposal rights over their surplus, because that is the person who is going to get rich, or the people who are going to get rich selling that surplus. and you need to understand their supply chains. Like their inputs, their outputs, their intermediary steps, and the movement of goods. Like if you master those three things, you've got yourself an economy. In my opinion, I don't know. My you know, and I have an actual economist among the members, so I don't know. I don't know if he's online in today's stream, but those are my three things. Now, I did actually like build out a whole little model in the book. So let me show you that quickly. Of how to arg here. All right. Let me show you the actual little model. So this is the 7-layer model. Let me just move back to single pages. When you buy the book, you'll also be able to download this as like a separate infographic with all of these details on it. But basically, your economy comes down to understanding your core wealth, like what is wealth. This is the economic steering and wealth distribution is your surplus, like who has control over your surplus. What is the objective of your economy? Who produces food? Who produces all kinds of other craft and activities? Where are your markets? How do people trade? And what do they use for money? Then how is that regulated? That's your institutions, your economic laws, and your cultural attitudes towards economy. And then finally, your global trade and how resilient is your economy. And those are the layers of your economy. So if you understand that, you will pretty much have a golden economy, or at least a one that makes sense. So yeah. Well, thanks, boss. I'm glad you enjoy the videos. Yeah. So yeah, this is my what I wanted to talk about today, and the reason why I wanted to talk about all of this kind of supply chain stuff and so on is obviously because, oh my goodness. Okay, so so I'm shipping the physical books. But now the books are being printed in Poland because Poland is the cheapest place to print colored books that your full color books that isn't China. And I didn't want to print in China because there's all kinds of logistical problems there, and I have some issues with doing business with China. Anyway, so that's a separate issue. So I'm printing in Poland. Okay, cool. But now I have to get the books from Poland to the United States for like all of the backers there. But that's almost impossible at the moment because there's been this massive disruption to the supply chain with the de minimis exception going away in the United States. That is the exception that says we don't care about packages that are less than like whatever amount of money, $500 or $800 or whatever. We don't, they can just come in. Because that's gone, every package now has to be customs checked, and that makes shipping really expensive. Now, the only country in the larger Europe that is still shipping to America is Britain. So now I've got to get the books from Poland to Britain. Okay, to ShipQuest, who's my GameQuest, who's my fulfillment partner, because they can actually mail the books out to the United States. But they're no longer part of the European Union. So the printer doesn't want to ship to them because the printer's like, your address is in the European Union. So we must ship to somebody in the European Union. I don't know why this is the rule. I don't know why it matters, but it's their rule. So now I'm like, how am I going to get these books from my house in Finland into Britain. At one point, I was thinking, I am going to load those books into my van because I own a van, like a little commercial van kind of thing. I'm going to load them into my van and I'm going to drive them to England. It's like, I'll take 4 days off and I'll just drive them to England. It was insane. It was insane. But a solution has been found. GameQuest has a warehouse in the Netherlands, so I'm shipping the books from Poland to the Netherlands, and then they will handle the book distribution internally. So it got me really thinking about logistics. Oh, thanks, Laura. I'll bear that in mind. But I would have stayed with Guy if that happened. Guy Slanders, who is a very good friend of mine back from South Africa. But I appreciate the offer. But yeah, so it's like that kind of logistical thing is a mess, and then anything can impact these supply chains, like it's not just a case of like the tariffs. The big change with America, with sending goods to America, is the lack of de minimis exception, because all packages are now being tracked. And now because China has now started flooding Europe with goods, right? So now Europe is saying they're going to start applying a €3 price to every package that comes in order to stop basically China dumping goods here. So it's been bananas. It's I don't know what's going to happen to the world the world supply chains. I think we're in for a wild few years while we figure out what's going on with shipping. So DHS does ship, but it is frighteningly expensive. Like if I can get the books to England, they ship for like $30. If I try and ship them out of Europe, I'm looking at like $60 per book, and the book costs $60. It's insane. It's completely bananas. So yeah, I mean, it was like figuring out shipping was a thing. At one point I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to do like a weird print on demand here and like print in every country, and literally like just do like an Ingram Spark print in each country and just ship to that people in that country, because it was just it was bananas. But then thankfully the UK Royal Mail, shout out to the UK Royal Mail, ships to America for a relatively reasonable price. So yeah, then and I considered printing in America, right? But the problem is printing in color in America costs a bomb. Like comparative to European color prices, it is a solid 50% more expensive to print in America. I don't know why. I don't know if it's the paper. I don't know if it's the ink. I don't know if it's the process. But the cost of printing in America is massive. Oh, you never want to ship from Finland. Oh, good God, no. No, we are a tiny, tiny little market miles away from everywhere else with absolutely no convenient lanes. Okay. You don't want to ship from here. Everything is more expensive from here. Everything is more expensive bringing it into here. We just, our logistics is horrifying because there's only 5 million of us. So nobody cares. They're like, hey, if we don't ship to Finland, no one's going to miss their 5 million man market. It is what it is. But yeah, no, I got it sorted out. Like GameQuest will handle it like with internal movement and so on. But it was a process. It was a process. Yeah, greed is unfortunately very much with us, and it like I think what irritates me is like if these companies were having a problem, like if their profits were light, I would understand that, they need to push up prices in order to deal with the situation and so on. But they're recording record profits. I was like, you know what? You can cry me a freaking river, you know. You're recording record profits, and we're the ones paying for it. It irritates me. Yeah, yeah. I mean, old Sun Tzu had his points. Some of it is, obviously too relevant to his time, but the only general who understands the evil necessary of warfare can be victorious. War is a brutal endeavor. And you will not be successful. No, I will not think of the poor shareholders. The poor shareholders can kiss my ass. Yeah. 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 If there is one economist I would go back and like hit over the head with a giant club, it would be Milton Friedman, because it was his freaking only the shareholders matter. Like, no, it's not only the shareholders who matter. The rest of us are sitting in this freaking economy, you ass. Yeah, I don't know. I only studied economy at university, so, I've never actually practiced economics. I'm just a speculator and a chatter. So, I don't know. Maybe Milton Friedman had a point. I just don't feel that he did. In my opinion, I think Milton Friedman could have done with a club upside the head. Yes, the economy is a very big topic. All right. So, this is probably the last stream of this year. Thinking about it. Our next one will be in January. I'll put out a poll for it. I'll remember to put out like posts and all the rest of that. And I hope that you guys have an incredibly awesome Merry Christmas and an amazing New Year. And I think Hanukkah also falls around this time. And whatever you celebrate, I hope that it is a fantastic time for all of you. And I hope to see you in the new year. It has been a wild year. I think I started this year on 3,000 or 4,000 subscribers, and I'm now at almost 20. So it's been insane. And I appreciate all of you who are here, who watch the videos, who leave comments, who, I do read the comments, just, I do even try to respond to most of them. So I very, very, very much appreciate all of you. And, I would not have a channel without an audience. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to me yap. Thank you for engaging with my yapping and sharing my content with the world and all the rest of that stuff. So, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and I will see you in 2026. So, bye, guys.